Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to talk about the first chapter called Pragmatism and Religion in Richard Rorty's last book called Pragmatism as Anti-authoritarianism. So, the chapter Pragmatism and Religion from the book Pragmatism as Anti-authoritarianism. This chapter is fairly wide-ranging. All of it is about pragmatism and religion, but it talks about it in several different ways. It brings in several different authors, and it makes a lot more sense as the introductory chapter to a book or the first lecture in a lecture series, which is what it originally was, than as a stand-alone article with a very precise thesis. So, with that in mind, let's delve into this chapter and see what Rorty has to say. He starts out, and he also ends, by telling us what the main idea, what the main theme is. And the main idea of the book as a whole, I suppose, is that pragmatism has to be understood as anti-authoritarianism. And then the main idea of this chapter is to see how that works out when we think about religion. So, what is it to claim that pragmatism is anti-authoritarianism? And what does it have to do with religion? Well, to claim that pragmatism is anti-authoritarianism is to claim that the pragmatist rejects all idea of a non-human authority. Like the only authority, Rorty tells us, that a pragmatist accepts, or that we ourselves should accept, because of course Rorty thinks this is the right move to make, is our own authority. And with our own, he doesn't mean me, right? He doesn't mean that I only have to listen to myself and not to other people. What he means, and makes very explicit, is that the only authority that I have to listen to is people with needs, right? Concrete, real people with their concrete, real needs. If I wonder whether I ought to be doing something, well, the question is it going to bring happiness? Is it going to bring distress? I mean, who does it help? Who does it hurt? And so on and so forth. But that is also the only question, right? The only question is, what is its effect on people, on myself and on other people, on concrete, real people? And the question is not, apart from that maybe, does this action of mine fit some extra human authority? Right? Does it fit the canon of moral law? Does it fit the demands of God? Does it fit some structure in reality? That is not the question. So, anti-authoritarianism here is the rejection of all authorities beyond the human. Right? If we want to know what we ought to do, well, then we need to talk to each other. We need to discuss what each of us wants. We need to discuss how to get there. We need to discuss how to maybe reconcile desires that seem to sort of conflict, and so on. That's what we have to do. But we don't have to worry about getting things right for something outside of the human. Now, according to Rorty, what the Enlightenment has done for us is it has made us very comfortable with the idea that this is the case in ethics. Right? So the traditional story is that an ethically good action is one that fits the will of God. And that's an authority beyond the human. And in the Enlightenment, this idea is gradually replaced by the idea that an ethically good action is one that we can justify to our fellow human beings. Right? And that is, according to Rorty, exactly right. But he thinks that pragmatism goes a step further. Because pragmatism doesn't just apply this to ethics, it also applies it to epistemology. And so in epistemology too, when we ask whether something is what we ought to believe, right, that ought, according to the pragmatist, has to be understood in terms of our fellow human beings. Right? We ought to believe probably what we can justify to our fellow human beings, or we ought not believe what we can't justify to our fellow human beings, something like that. It's not the case that we ought or ought not believe something depending on an extra human authority, right? Something beyond us as a community. In particular, it's not the case that we ought to believe certain things because they fit the structure of reality or something like that, right? Where that is understood as an authority beyond human justification, human interaction, human needs and desires. So, what Rorty tells us is that for the pragmatist, the idea that truth is correspondence with the intrinsic nature of reality is just as wrong, and in fact perfectly analogous to, the claim that morality is correspondence to the will of God. Right? So the pragmatist denies that morality is correspondence to the will of God. Instead, it has to do with, getting our desires into harmony with the desires of other human beings and finding better ways to live, right? That allow all of us to become more happy and fulfilled. In the same way, truth should not be thought of as correspondence to the intrinsic nature of reality. Rather, when we think about epistemic categories, again, what we need to think about is justifying things to our fellow human beings, engaging in projects that make all our lives better, right? And we ought to believe those things that make all our lives better and that we can justify to each other and so on. So that is the basic story. And here's an analogy or a thought experiment that Rorty doesn't use, but maybe it's useful for us to wrap our minds around this. Let us imagine that we are the last person in the universe. Right? Humanity has died out. It's very sad. You are alone on a desert island with luckily enough to eat and drink. Are there still demands of morality on you? Well, I think it's fairly natural for most of us to think that no. I mean, if you're the only person around, there are no demands of morality on you. Right? There's nobody who you can harm or hurt or help or whatever. So sort of the moral requires a social context. Now, Rorty's suggestion is that the same is true about the epistemological. Right? If you're alone on this desert island, there are also no duties to believe or not believe anything. And when you think about it that way, I think it makes some sense. Right? I mean, you can have the wackiest beliefs that there are. Well, it's not going to hurt anyone, except maybe yourself. But, I mean, you probably don't have that kind of obligation to yourself. And even if you have an obligation to yourself, it would seem to be only the obligation to not act in ways that will harm you sort of practically. Right? So the idea that there is still a sort of demand that you find out the truth, even though there are no other people, well, that's the kind of thing where Rorty says, no, I mean, it's not there. And thinking about this person alone on a desert island, yeah, maybe they have some very weird religious beliefs that they don't have any good arguments for. Well, who cares, right? I mean, is it wrong? According to Rorty, there couldn't be anything wrong about that, right? There's just no normativity there when there are no other human beings. So, that is the basic idea, the basic theme in the background here. And now the structure of the chapter is that Rorty is going to talk about three fairly separate things that have to do with the way that pragmatists have thought about religion. And so in the first, or rather the second part of the chapter, after the introduction, in the second part of the chapter, Rorty is going to talk about the three classic American pragmatists, Peirce and James and Dewey, and sort of trying to tell us a little bit about how they differ in their thinking about religion and how they struggle or don't struggle with it, how they try to handle it. In the second section, which is section 3, he is going to talk about Freud and pragmatism as anti-authoritarianism again. And so he's going to bring in Freud in order to work through the stuff that I just said in a slightly different way. And then in the fourth section, he is going to delve into especially James and his ideas about truth and what they have to do with religion. So let's take those three sections in turn. And again, I mean, it's more sort of Rorty working out a theme in sort of several different places than him telling one perfectly coherent story that comes towards some kind of conclusion. So, classic American pragmatism. We're talking about Peirce, James, and Dewey, the three great American pragmatists. And one of the things that Rorty tells us that was a little bit surprising to me, maybe in part because I don't know these authors so well, is he says, look, they are extremely different. They're very different from each other. They don't have a lot more in common than sort of any three European philosophers in the same time frame. I mean, if you take Russell and Husserl and, Brentano, I mean, yeah, they have something to do with each other, but they also have completely different ideas about lots of things. And he says, the fact that we have brought them together into this thing called American pragmatism is probably mostly because Americans really wanted a philosophical movement of their own. Right? So he really plays down the idea that there is a coherent strand of philosophy here. These are three very different thinkers. And he is kind of critical about Peirce especially. So he talks a little bit about Peirce's metaphysics, which he thinks is fairly wild, not very useful. I mean, we don't really sort of need to delve into that if we want to understand pragmatism. And he thinks that when it comes to this question of religion, and especially this question of how to deal with the supposed clash between science and religion, he thinks Peirce is fairly superficial. So he tells us that Peirce comes up with a kind of easy compromise where he says, oh, look, religion is about ethics and science is about, finding the truth about the world, so they don't conflict. It's fine. You can have Christian ethics without Christian sort of metaphysical beliefs. That's it. And Rorty says, look, I mean, that's a little bit too easy. James thought it was too easy. Dewey thought it was too easy, in the same way that Nietzsche thought it was too easy. So he's going to set aside Peirce. He's not going to do a lot with Peirce. Dewey, he won't talk that much about Dewey in the rest of this lecture, but he does intimate that he thinks Dewey is the most relevant of the pragmatists, the one that we can still learn most from, and the one whom we will see most in the rest of these lectures. So although Dewey is not going to play the foremost role in this particular lecture, he does tell us that Dewey is going to play a large role later on. So, is there something in general we can say here in this section about classical pragmatism and religion? Well, Rorty says, famously, pragmatism is sort of anti-metaphysical. Right? It tries to do away with a lot of these metaphysical debates because they don't make a difference in practice to how we do things. But, he says, what's maybe less well known, but no less true, is that classical pragmatism is anti-positivist. So it is against the idea that there are these sort of truths that come to us in a very pure way through something like science, on which we then, build our entire worldview maybe, or our entire philosophy, or our entire belief system. What pragmatism does is it emphasizes the idea that beliefs have to be evaluated in terms of a practice, in terms of the difference that they make to how we act, right? So beliefs have to be seen as part of a pattern of action, as part of a way that we behave, and that is necessary if we want to evaluate them. If you want to evaluate whether something is a good belief, you have to wonder what it makes us do. Well, what's the point of doing that? Well, one of the points of doing that for the classical pragmatists, according to Rorty, is that it allows communication across divides. So if people have very different temperaments, they have maybe very different intellectual temperaments, maybe one of them is very much interested in empirical research and one of them is really into sort of more abstract thinking. I mean, how are these views ever going to come together? Well, what we can always do is we can go to the shared arena of behavior, of people's desires, of what they want, of how they interact, and we can look at those beliefs there. And so what might also be possible is that we can communicate across the science-religion division, right, in a way that is more fruitful than just saying that, oh, there are two different ways of approaching the world and maybe they clash, right, or maybe they're just different or something like that. The point is, Rorty says, that we have to think about what the beliefs that we get from science and the beliefs that we get from religion do, right? How they are reflected in action. And then we can see whether they clash or don't clash, which ones we have to give up because they don't help us, which ones we have to retain because they do help us. And so that's the way that we need to think about this. And we are already moving towards, and Rorty will make this extremely explicit also later on, we are moving towards Rorty's own story about religion, which is going to hinge on his public-private distinction. And so the idea that Rorty in the end is going to defend is that science gives us, lots of insights into the world that are publicly relevant. Right? We need them to solve problems that have to do with the ways that we human beings interact. They have to do with, these are problems where finding the solution is something that requires, let's say, maybe implementation in society. It is something that affects not just me, right? The way that we deal with the natural world, the way that we deal with animals or plants or diseases or whatever. All this stuff that science tells us about is going to have to do with these practical matters that require human cooperation and involve other people and their desires and interests and so on. Whereas religion for Rorty is going to fall on what he calls the private side of life, where, okay, maybe I am, dealing with these problems, which are also important for my own well-being, questions maybe about my purpose, questions maybe about what will happen to me after I die, and so on and so forth. But getting an answer to these questions from religion, according to Rorty, is, that's sort of my own affair. Right? If I believe that the purpose of my life is this or that, if I believe that after I die I will go to heaven or I won't go to heaven, or I will maybe be punished or I won't be punished or whatever, that's not, those beliefs, I can have them and they can inform my life and shape my feelings without anybody else getting, in the way of that or becoming the victim of that, and so on and so forth. Of course, that requires a very particular way of taking religion, right? There are many ways of engaging with religion that do not fulfill this requirement that it is inside the private space. And those are going to be ways of dealing with religion that Rorty probably doesn't like very much. Right? If my religious beliefs are going to be imposed on you, well, what's the kind of story that I could be telling? Right? Suppose that I tell you that you can't do certain things because of my religious beliefs. Well, that only makes sense if it doesn't make a lot of sense if I say, well, my religious beliefs are such and such. If you do this, you go to hell, so you can't do it. That doesn't make sense because this other person says, well, I don't believe in hell. Yeah, okay, that's the end of the conversation, right? But it stops becoming the end of the conversation when I say, oh, you can't do those and those things because God has forbidden it, right? And I'm not going to let you do the stuff that God has forbidden. We've got to obey the authority of God, right? Then I'm bringing in this extra human authority, right? This authority beyond the human to which I have submitted and I want you to submit to. That's the kind of religion that doesn't fit Rorty's pragmatist view of society, of how we ought to act, right? Because now I'm bringing in this extra human authority. I'm not talking to you. I'm not worrying about your desires. I just have this belief about how we ought to act, which comes from outside of us, right? It comes from God, and now I'm going to make you submit, maybe, right? If I have the political power to do so. So Rorty believes that religion can be good if it happens in the private sphere. And he believes that it's probably going to be bad because it's going to be authoritarian if it happens in the public sphere. Because now my religious beliefs are going to sort of appeal to this extra human authority and require other people to obey this authority as well. So, coming back to this question of the relation between science and religion, what we are seeing in James especially, Rorty tells us, is that he cares about tolerance. Right? What he believes is that once you accept a pragmatist theory of truth, you can get to a state of tolerance where science tolerates religion and religion tolerates science, because they can never clash. How do you do that? Well, the idea is that the pragmatist story about truth tells us that something is true if it's useful for us to believe it, and that kind of relativizes truth towards certain goals. So if science has certain goals and religion has other goals, then there's really no way for them to clash, right? Because we sort of generating those beliefs with respect to different goals, and so in a sense in different contexts where it's hard for them to ever interact or clash. So that is the way that James is trying to sort of bridge the divide and get to a story about science and religion that works. We'll get to James again in the final section. At this point, Rorty turns to a fairly surprising figure when we're talking about pragmatism. He turns to Sigmund Freud, the Austrian psychiatrist and maybe also, in a certain sense, a philosopher. And maybe even more surprising, Rorty is going to bring in the idea, he has already brought in the idea that pragmatism is sort of the fulfillment of the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment rejected authority, and now what pragmatism does is it fulfills the Enlightenment by doing that not only in the sphere of ethics, but also in the sphere of epistemology. In this section, Rorty is going to tell us that pragmatism is the fulfillment of two other things as well. So he is drawing all these historical developments, and pragmatism becomes the logical endpoint of all of them, or at least of the three of them that we are seeing here. And so the first that he mentions here is the Renaissance. So we had the Enlightenment, now we get the Renaissance. And he tells us that the Renaissance is characterized by a change of human focus from eternity to futurity. So eternity would be thinking about God and what is eternal and always the same, whereas futurity is about the future, right? It's about what happens in the future, what's going to change, how can we make the world a better place, what can we achieve? So that's the idea of the Renaissance. And then he says, well, look, that is something that really only is accomplished by pragmatism. Because only in pragmatism does everything, right? Both ethics and epistemology again. Is it going to be sort of the only norms that we are going to accept are norms that come from the question, is this going to make the world a better place? Right? So we're no longer trying to sort of get at the eternal structure of reality or something like that. The only thing we ask when it comes to norms is, will this make the world a better place? That is how pragmatism wants to accomplish this movement of the Renaissance. Now, we get Freud. And in particular, we get something from what Rorty in the text calls Freud's wackiest book. And that is Moses and Monotheism. The man Moses and Monotheism. In which Freud tells this story about the primal, original father murder, or parasite, right? That means father murder. And so Freud gives us this myth, basically, I would say, about an authoritarian father who tries to lord it over his sons until one day they come together and kill him, right? They kill him. And then maybe there's a power struggle and one of them tries to become the new father until they realize that that doesn't work. They have to cooperate. Right? So here we have in a nutshell authoritarianism going towards democracy, right? Going towards cooperation and working together. But Freud says, psychologically that's not really how it works because this authoritarian figure is still there in the background. And so this becomes Freud's story about the origins of religion. So the sons who murdered their father are maybe haunted by some kind of guilt or fear, and they want to placate that. And so they come up with the idea of, let's say, some spirit, some totem animal, something that is strong, that is in a sense a bit father-like, and that we can worship, and that we can make happy with sacrifices so that it won't punish us. Right? So the idea of the authoritarian father gets turned into a sort of religious totem, something like that. And then there's a story about how this develops through like how this becomes a person again. It becomes a sort of mother goddess, and then it becomes polytheism. But then in the end, sort of at the end of this religious development, the father figure reappears as God the Father of the monotheistic religions. So there he is, once again, the ultimate authoritarian father has taken the place of the real authoritarian father. And, well, there's one problem, which is that this father is even stronger and more powerful. Although, on the other hand, he's also not sort of concretely there, so maybe that gives us some more leeway. But we sort of got back to the authoritarian structure that we came from. And so I suppose Nietzsche would say, well, we have to kill the father again, right? We have to kill God again. And Rorty agrees, you could say. And what he tells us, and this is a fascinating sentence, I think, he tells us, only pragmatism reaps the full advantage of parasite. So only pragmatism reaps the full advantage of parasite. How is that? Well, only pragmatism can really get us out of this authoritarianism, right? This killing of the father, which is at the same time the root of religious thought and metaphysical thought, which leads to the monotheistic religions with their God the Father authority figure, or to metaphysics with this reality authority figure. Well, only pragmatism can get us sort of really beyond that and let us reap the fruits of both science and religion that is liberated from all authoritarian structures. Right? So we have in Freud this story about the development of religion, and we see that religion is sort of starts out as an anti-authoritarian move, which doesn't quite succeed. And Rorty tells us that the history of monotheism and the history of metaphysics are sort of a long story of how the real fruits of the parasite, the real rejection of authoritarianism, the real embrace of democracy, how it gets deferred and deferred and deferred and deferred and deferred, and pragmatism is going to try to accomplish it, right? It's going to try to finally really break free of authoritarianism. So again, that's the story now told using Freud and his myth of the original father murder. So that gets us to the very last section, and I already told you quite a bit about it, because this is where Rorty talks most extensively about the idea of a public-private split, and he does it using William James. In particular, he tells us that we only have an obligation to justify our beliefs in particular situations. It's not something that is inherent to the nature of belief itself, or something that is an obligation on us as such. We need to justify our beliefs only when our habits of action interfere with the needs and desires of other people. Right? So if I have beliefs that just don't concern you in any practical way, I also don't have to justify them to you. Right? There's no normativity there. As soon as my beliefs make me act in certain ways that interfere with you, your desires and wants, I should be justifying them, and of course, you should be justifying yours if they interfere with mine. So again, that's the story that is going to lead Rorty to claim that religion is fine as long as you can privatize it, as long as you can make those religious beliefs, which might be very important for you on a personal level when it comes to achieving certain, let's say, spiritual goals, as long as you can privatize them and not make them interfere with other people's lives, there's no need to justify them. Right? You don't have to give arguments. You couldn't tell a sort of Richard Dawkins-like story about how you are bad and sort of epistemologically evil because you believe these things for which you don't have good arguments. Rorty delves into a little bit into the discussion that William James gets himself into with W.K. Clifford. And Clifford, as James presents him, tells us that we have a duty to seek the truth, which is distinct from our duty to seek happiness. Right? So there are two duties: seeking the truth and seeking happiness. And pragmatism for Rorty is the claim that there are not two duties. Right? There is only the duty to seek human happiness, and the duty to seek truth is relevant insofar as it leads to happiness. Right? That's where the normativity of truth finds its only place. It's where we have to think and cooperate and so on in order to make the world a better place. Again, we are sort of making this Renaissance move of dropping eternity, like the structure of the real, for futurity, having a better world. And Rorty has a story about this, which I personally would have liked to see worked out in more detail. He tells us a little bit about how maybe the contemporary idea of inferentialism suggests that there is a duty to seek the truth. So inferentialism would be the idea that the content of our beliefs is defined by the inferential moves we are willing or obligated to make. So if I believe something, what it means to believe that thing just depends on what things I would infer it from and what other things I would infer from it. Right? And of course those are actions, right? I mean, inferring things, those are actions. So it would seem that like parts of my behavior determine what I believe, what the content of my belief is. And so an inferentialist might say, look, in order to even have beliefs, in order to play this game of beliefs, I have to be willing to engage in argument, right? Because these argumentative structures define the content of my beliefs, right? To define what it is to believe something. And so whatever your belief is, you should be willing to engage in argument. Well, Rorty doesn't think so, and James tells us that there are certain things that people believe that you just can't settle by argument. Right? And one example might be the existence of God. I mean, people have argued about it for a long time. It's hard to claim that there are sort of arguments that are so strong that clearly everyone has to reach the same conclusion. And so somebody like Clifford maybe might say, well, in that case, I mean, if that's really true, then you oughtn't believe anything. Right? You have a duty to not believe anything if there are no good arguments for it. You can hope or desire maybe that God exists or that there is an afterlife or whatever it is that we're talking about, but you're not allowed to believe it. And here what Rorty wants us to do is he wants us to become skeptical of this dualism between, on the one hand, desires and hopes, and on the other hand, beliefs. And what he wants us to adopt is this William James-like picture where beliefs are always related to certain desires. Right? There are desires that we have when we're doing science, and they lead to certain beliefs. And there are desires that maybe, for those of us who engage in religion, that are caught up in this religious way of thinking, and they lead to other beliefs. And that's fine. And again, Rorty's story is going to be that they can't clash as long as we manage to make the religious beliefs private, and then the scientific beliefs can be public. So, to wrap things up, Rorty emphasizes that the pragmatist rejects the idea of Clifford that there are two quests. The quest for truth and the quest for happiness or a better future. Anti-authoritarianism is only achieved, and so pragmatism is only achieved, when we reject that idea. Right? When we see the quest for truth as part of the quest for happiness, as part of the quest to achieve a better future altogether as human beings in what in other texts Rorty calls the continuing conversation of mankind.